CJ, one of the things about this Thornton deal that's really interesting, when we were sort of texting back and forth, and Eric, I'd love for you to weigh in on this too, is the fact that when you're over 35 and you sign a contract, there are performance bonuses that are that you can either have included or get rid of them, basically kind of like a rookie contract in reverse. Joe Thornton said, I'm not going to take those. Can you tell us, well, I guess there's no way he fits under the cap without them, but beyond that, it's a pretty big move on his part, no?
I think so. And look, guys like Joe Thornton get those bonuses all the time. If you look back at the deal Justin Williams signed with Carolina last season, it was $700,000 base and up to $2.5 million you could make. Teams like those because you can push the bonuses ahead a year. So you can actually be over the cap in the current year and push any bonus money into the next season. But, in this case, I think the Leafs basically just went to Joe and said, hey, we have lots of cap problems. They're well documented. Look at, go to Cap Friendly. You can see what our issues are here. And if you want to sign with us, you can give us the most amount of flexibility by taking the league minimum. It's what Jason Spetz has done. And, look, I don't want to speak for Joe's financial picture, but I think he's done pretty well in his career. I think he's at 110 million, give or take, on the career earnings. So, the Leafs were able to get him as part of that. I think that was always the deal that was sort of upfront what was discussed. And, it helps Toronto out because even every 100,000 is going to matter for them next season. And I guess what you have here is a guy who wanted to come and play in Toronto. I don't think he considered that many other places. I don't know how many other teams were interested beyond the Leafs in San Jose, but this was either a come home, try to win a cup kind of thing, or stay where you've always been in San Jose, and he chose Toronto.
Do you think the reason he chose Toronto, and Eric, sorry, Eric, let me get your thoughts on that too. Do you think from a Joe Thornton perspective, you've interviewed Joe as well, and you've obviously tons of time with him. Is he the kind of guy that when he comes to this city, I hate doing this because every time Toronto signs a free agent of note, we tend to turn on them. Like I think back to how excited I was when the Leafs signed Larry Murphy, and how he came in, and I know that Joe Thornton is not in his prime like Larry Murphy was, and then Larry Murphy was bounced out of town and then won a couple cups with Detroit, and then you had I remember when Dimitri Kristich came in and wasn't good, fans turned on him, moved. Is it weird to bring up the fact that I know Jumbo's Jumbo, but I'm a little freaked out about the expectations that Leaf fans may have about him, and are we at the end of the season going to be, are Leaf fans going to be like they were with Patrick Marleau? Love the player, just not a fit anymore.
$700,000. I mean, you're getting a player who's a Hall of Fame player. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, then you'll say goodbye and he'll walk away amicably, I'm sure. But I think what's interesting actually, and getting back to something CJ just said, is, here's a guy that if he decided he was leaving San Jose, it's because he believes he can win in Toronto. And if I'm a player that's in that room, having a guy like Joe Thornton actually have that belief that he's willing to leave the lifestyle that going back in time and certainly beyond last trade deadline, I don't think he wanted to leave there. I know that by the time it got to last trade deadline, he did want to leave there and was probably disappointed that he didn't. I think Elliot Friedman reported that. I think it should really mean something to the players in Toronto. And I think they'll do everything they can to make sure and help him in his transition to their team. And I think it's $700,000, guys. It's a no-brainer. He's going to be a good player. And even Leafs fans, even the ones who are least adjusted, will have a reasonable expectation for what the player can actually bring.
Is that a shot at Steve?
Quit calling Dangle out that way. Come on. This is his podcast.
Hey, Chris, do you think...
least adjusted. I love that.
Yeah, that's a really well put comment. Really well put.
Steve in a nutshell.
Chris, do you think that the Leafs are... do you think they're actually because Dubas always plays his cards close to the chest, especially when it comes to trades. We rarely hear about them before they're about to happen. He says in the press conference today, he would be surprised if they added in anybody of note or of impact. Do you really think they're done? Are they going to be able to fit Mikheyev and Dermott's contracts underneath I guess they've got $1.4 million, they're saying? How is that going to work? Do they move someone else out? Is Kyle just playing his cards close to the chest? Because I think that surprised a lot of people.
I don't think he actually is in this case. I mean, because one thing he also said is that they might carry a 20-man roster. And so if you take this down to 20-man roster, I think even with the Mikheyev sign and Dermott sign for whatever they signed for, and look, I think they're both somewhere in the $1 million range on a short-term deal. I think you can make the numbers work, but what that's going to mean is they're going to have to put players on waivers. They're going to send waiver exempt guys down. It might mean that Nick Robertson isn't part of this roster next year, at least to start or as a full-time member. I mean, there's still some unknowns because we don't totally know what the American Hockey League is going to look like. I don't know if the Ontario Hockey League is going to get up and running as it intends to in January. And so that might affect how you handle someone like Robertson. So, I think he's being truthful in the sense that, that they don't have to trade guys, and certainly they're not in the market now, I don't think, for other players. But this is a weird year. I mean, I'm curious to see how this develops in terms of our teams carrying a taxi squad. Is the AHL just sort of functioning as something like normal where you have normal waiver rules in terms of sending players up and down? But I think the Leafs wanted to get a little bit more depth this year because they feel as though with the compacted season and perhaps some different rules that they might be beneficial to have as many NHL players as they do right now.
The Habs are doing that, by the way. They're in the same spot for once, the first time in half a decade. They're standing all the way to the cap and considering going with 19, 20 players on the roster. And I think it's going to be a lot of daily management to be compliant. They have a player in Cale Fleury who's ready to play in the NHL, but likely is going to be in the American Hockey League if they're playing, just because he's waiver exempt. And they're going to risk losing a guy like Noah Juleson, but maybe in a year where teams at the beginning of the year are going to have a very hard time claiming players. I don't know how that's going to go, but I could see that. I guess Toronto and Montreal will probably not be alone in carrying less than a 23-man roster for a lot of the season.
Is there a chance, guys, that they enact some sort of taxi squad concept where players are able to, say, practice with the team but wouldn't be considered on the cap? So you can have, say, like, let's say there's no AHL and there's no CHL, which is very possible at this point, right? How those are gate-driven leagues. I don't know how they would plan on making money if you can't get fans into the stands. If Nick Robertson can't play in the CHL or the OHL or wherever, and he can't play in the AHL, do you let him go to Europe, or do you let him, or can you have a guy like him? And I hesitate to say this name, but Martin Marinchin's going to be hanging around. Guys that are depth pieces that would still be able to practice with the teams, get some ice time in, and be called on when needed. But teams would then be able to remain cap compliant. Like, are they going to make any adjustments to that?
Well, you're talking with the great unknown here. I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish we knew what the season was going to look like, what this was going to look like. One thing I've heard discussed that I think is very possible. I mean, look, we all know the All-Canadian division is basically a lock, if only just because the government's forcing it on the NHL. It's not that the NHL feels that this is some perfect solution to any problem, but if you can't have American teams travel into Canada, then you have the Canadian teams play each other. Well, I think one thing that's been discussed is to have the AHL teams essentially travel with their NHL teams and play at the same time. So if a team like the Leafs goes to Vancouver, you bring the Marlies with them, and Vancouver's going to have the Utica Comets have to be in Vancouver now because you can't have teams operational in the U.S. When you want to call players up, and likely the Marlies will play the Comets as part of that same series, whether it's earlier in the day or on the off day between games or what have you. I think that's what's likely going to happen. I just don't know what all those rules will look like, because those are all very important questions, especially for teams like Toronto, Montreal, which are going to operate close to the cap ceiling, which are going to have transactions back and forth with the AHL. I don't know if the reserve team, if the AHL team, the taxi squad, whatever we're going to call this thing, I don't know how that's all going to work. But it's going to be huge for teams like, especially Toronto, Montreal, that are going to be dancing that sort of hula hoop under the cap ceiling.
For me, it's such a crazy thing in general, just because you look at different player situations, like a player like Nick Robertson. Like, you need this guy playing games. He's got to be playing. I mean, you just saw Montreal loan Jesperi Kotkaniemi to his hometown team, and I don't know what they're planning on doing with Nick Suzuki, and I don't think it's necessarily the same situation, but the last thing you want is for these guys to be sitting for such an extensive period of time. I think of a guy like Alex Romanov, who came over while the Canadians were in the bubble, and he got to practice and get exposed to the organization, albeit in Toronto and not in Montreal. But, here's a guy that his season ended in the KHL in March, and he hasn't played a game since, and he's expected to be a really important player for them next season, even if he's starting on the the third pair. You know, Bergevin has talked about him as a guy that he sees as a top pairing defenseman down the line. How much does that process get slowed down? And another thing that a buddy of mine brought up is like, if we're looking at the length or the career span of a player, is it possible that not playing games for a long period of time helps create that longevity that hasn't been there in the past? There's just so many of these unknowns, and do they balance each other out? I don't know, but I wish we had more answers, because people keep asking me, and I'm sure they're definitely asking CJ a lot more than me. And we don't know where we're going, and we just hope that when we get there, it's that the games are getting played.